Good evening, YouTubers. I was just watching a podcast of Dominic Fisby. He was a guest on what Bitcoin did, which is Peter. I forget his last name, but it's really fascinating. They talked about many subjects: gold, Bitcoin, and kind of the future, how it's going to unfold. And what was really fascinating was they talked about The Sovereign Individual, which was authored by Lord Rees-Mogg and another author, I forget. When I was a young guy, I read that. That was a very fascinating book when I was a kid growing up. And I don't really remember the whole of the book, but what I remember is basically that in the future, there'd be a lot more freedom and liberty, at least for some people. And I'll get why I say that in a minute. And people will be living in tax havens, traveling amongst tax havens. And for some individuals, their taxes will go down. Their freedom and liberty will go up. Anyways, why I mention all that is because Dominic Fisby was talking about kind of the rise of the digital nomad. Now, that's the word he used mostly in the podcast. They were talking about digital nomads and how there's an accounting firm, and I forget, it's in the UK, I think, an accounting firm that did some study talking about how there's going to be more and more job losses in the future. So there's going to be less and less people working any kind of traditional job. And there's going to be more job losses of low-skilled labor and things like that. So more unemployment. But what will happen is that will create a lot of opportunities for the gig economy. And how that's all related to what The Sovereign Individual, what was in that book, is Dominic was talking about how now it's starting to happen with the rise of the digital nomads. They just live all over the world. They're like non-doms, like in the UK. They're not domiciled anywhere for tax reasons usually. Or if they're domiciled somewhere where tax is either low or it doesn't exist. Or for all practical matters, they don't have to pay tax. Usually by moving around every 6 months. They were talking about how that's going to make it more and more difficult for governments to tax these digital nomads, these gig economies type workers. In fact, they were talking about how if you're working the gig economy, the money's not taken out, which I already recognize, out of your check. You have to pay it later. And whether through hook or crook or intention or not, it's harder to motivate people to get them to pay those taxes. So a lot of times, either because they don't want to pay, they don't think they have to pay, or whatever, they don't pay. So it's hard, but it's hard for the government to come after them and get their money. Because nowadays you can work online, bank anywhere in the world, and if you want, you can transact in digital currencies, which is really difficult for the government. It's not secret or hidden, but it's, difficult for governments to follow all of it and get the money out of the end, taxpayer. But basically what Dominic was saying and Peter was, we're going to a future where half the people are going to be kind of sovereign individuals, or what they were calling digital nomads in the interview. The other half of the workers are going to be working traditional type jobs if there's, what's left. And they're going to be kind of like serfs in that they're going to be tied to the land. Kind of like what Doug Casey talks about, medieval serfs tied to the land, where they have to tolerate, put up with it, whatever tax regulation, mind control as far as the politically correctness of what you're supposed to think, how you're supposed to behave in society. So that was really fascinating, because I remember as a kid reading that book thinking how that would come about, and we're now in a time where it's never been easier for people with skills or creative skills and talents to earn money anywhere in the world. In fact, Peter was just saying he can basically put his podcast gear in his backpack and live anywhere. He once said on a previous podcast, which shocked me, that if they made Bitcoin illegal, he was just going to move himself to Malta. Or that's one place he thought about. Because his whole business is now Bitcoin, so why stick around if you're not wanted? Now, I personally don't think that's going to happen, but who knows? But the rise of the digital nomad, the word they use, or the sovereign individual, like Lord Rees-Mogg was talking about all those years ago, is going to make it tougher and tougher for governments to collect these taxes. So what Dominic was saying was the people who will bear the burden of all these taxes will be the people, or the half the people who can't move. Now, why I say half is this accounting firm came up with this idea that half these people be digital nomads and gig workers. That's really, really difficult to tax them. Not impossible, very difficult. So if they're traveling from country to country, how do you tax them? How do they get the governments decide who gets to tax them? And basically what they were coming down to is governments will compete to let them live in certain countries tax-free anyway. So if they try to crack down, it won't really work. That's already starting to happen. You can already see that in the United States, where some states are raising taxes, some are lowering them. So people are just moving wherever their taxes lower for their business. Now, that doesn't work for federal taxes, but for local taxes, that works pretty good. So it was very, very fascinating. And I just, thinking about it, this is the world we're living in. This is what I've been thinking about for a long time. This is where we're going to go. And I forgot to close that loop where Dominic was saying the people who are stuck, living in one country, they will be the ones bearing the burden probably of the inflation tax, because they're not going to get their money out of their local currency. Some will, some won't. But local real estate taxes, they'll have to pay rising real estate tax. I don't keep up with the United Kingdom, but since he lives there in London, I think, and there's all these new proposed taxes that I think the Conservative government's proposing, which is really fascinating because they're supposed to be the party of lower tax, but they're putting up tax. They're proposing other taxes to go up, so it's very fascinating. But anyways, basically what Dominic was saying is, with this COVID thing, all these governments are borrowing money and then raising tax. And then as people become digital nomads, they move out of the tax net, or they move out of the tax net vis-a-vis going offshore or domiciling offshore or using digital currencies or using offshore banking, where it becomes very difficult to tax this stuff. So what he was saying, the people who will have to bear the tax are the people who can't move, don't want to move, or don't have the new skill sets for the new economy, so they'll be burdened with that. I would just add, they're also going to be burdened with the rising unemployment, rising welfare state that has to be funded, and it'll be funded primarily, at least in the United States, through more and more bonds, or money printing and issuing more bonds, which ultimately I think will be inflationary, because the bonds will be issued by I don't know how it works, but the Fed will buy up all the bonds that are issued by the Treasury, which to my understanding is inflationary in the long run. In other words, it's not going to be bought by investors from China or investors from Japan or American investors. It'll just be bought with an electronic bookkeeping entry from the Fed. Anyways, that was just fascinating to think. Now we're going to have like this rising digital class that moves around, lives wherever they want to live, or live wherever they're treated the best. Then you're going to have this other class that's kind of descending into more and more poverty, which you can see in the United States with all this rising homelessness and rising unemployment. The numbers seem to be coming down for unemployment, but they seem to be steadying and kind of rising up a little bit, depending on where you look. Another thing is there's going to be more and more homeless, mainly because if the Biden administration stops that moratorium on debt for mortgages and rents, people will have to start paying their mortgages and their rents they haven't paid. And if Biden doesn't do that, then they'll basically have to nationalize all the land or all the property in the United States. I don't see that happening, but it's a possibility. Either way, someone's going to be left holding the bag. Probably they're going to lift that moratorium. People can't pay. They'll be put out on the street. The Democrats will probably come up with a social program to try to fix that. It probably won't work. In the meantime, people will fall through the cracks. There'll be, more and more homelessness. Already we're seeing it like in numbers I've never seen it in my entire life. But anyways, my point is, there's going to be kind of a new serfdom bifurcated with another, like with what they were calling digital nomads, or how I would call sovereign individuals, people who just either bow to the system and stay in the United States, like live in a van or live in an RV, earn their money online, earn it in a way that's not taxable, store it in gold coins or store it in digital like assets like digital currencies. Now more and more there's like ETH coins that represent ownerships of real estate, like say in Switzerland. It represents ownership of gold, like held all over the world. That's Pax Gold, the Pax Gold coin. But there's going to be like, you're going to be able to buy like a chunk of real estate through a ETH coin, where the real estate's domiciled in Switzerland. Your ownership is just the ETH coin, and you'll just get paid by it that way. It's going to be very difficult for governments to follow all that and regulate it and tax it. And eventually what I think they're going to do is, like in the podcast with Dominic Frisby and Peter, they're going to have to compete by getting people to put their capital, their assets in certain areas. And then some of these Western countries will just go down the toilet because they can't compete. People will just leave. In fact, I was just commenting to some people today that you're seeing more and more young people from the West just leaving. And that's like the tax base of the future. And I had posted on another blog site that the birth rate in the United States is going down. Pre-COVID, it was kind of going down. Then with COVID, it's really, really plunged. People were suggesting there's going to be a baby boom. That hasn't happened. It's actually gotten worse. So now there's less and less of a tax base to tax, plus more and more traditional jobs are just being outsourced digitally or offshore. Then to add to that, a lot of countries don't want to bring in immigration, which I understand because of the welfare state problems. And then most welfare states can't even afford the people they have, especially in Europe and the United States and Canada and Australia, New Zealand. So it's just turned into this big mess. I think it's going to culminate in a big economic crisis where we'll see the value of the dollar, the euro, the yen, the pound sterling, the Aussie dollar, then the Kiwi dollar will be worth a lot less in terms of gold, in terms of probably Bitcoin, even in terms of land. I could see the land prices going up, not really because they're going up, but because these countries keep printing money like crazy to fund their deficits and their unfunded liability gaps. I see them trying to raise tax. I don't know how that'll work, because if they raise them too much, people are just going to leave. We've already kind of seen the beginnings of a collapse in Lebanon, where the 2019 to now, the Lebanese pound, I think it is, has lost 85% of its value. So people who got $1,000 now, when you adjust that now with all the inflation, they have the purchasing power of $120. So people who are working aren't going to be very loyal. This is a lot of government workers I was reading about getting the equivalent of $1,000 2 years ago, and now they're only getting the equivalent of $120. So they're not loyal and faithful workers. Then in Argentina, they just keep raising taxes in an environment where they're in a recession. I can see that happening to the Euroland and also in the United States. I just think we're going to go the way probably of Argentina, where we're going to try to raise tax. We'll see how it goes. And then when that doesn't work, they'll probably start printing money like Argentina, and then we'll get creeping inflation like 3, 4, 5%. I think that's around the corner where we print 3, 4, 5%. And we'll probably have rising unemployment and more inequality through the wealth gap from all this money printing. So it'll just be fascinating. Anyways, I just want to make this video, put it out there that Dominic Frisby or Fisby, I think, I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name, and then Peter from What Bitcoin Did had a really fascinating podcast about where this is all headed, where it's going to be more unemployment. There's going to be kind of two classes of workers who work anywhere in the world, and workers who are chained to their home countries, where they'll be taxed and regulated more and more and have a lower and lower standard of living. Workers who work in the gig economy or who work offshore or live and work offshore in other countries, they're going to be paying less and less tax and having an increasing standard of living. So like we're going to have like a new serfdom for one class of people, and a rising liberty for another class of people. So that's kind of what I see happening. And then you're going to have this thing where the governments are going to try to stop all this, but so far I don't think they're going to be that successful. In fact, they're saying, like I think, you're going to start to see governments in the Caribbean, in Asia, compete to get these workers to either legally domicile there or to live there for a certain amount of time, totally tax-free. Not all of them, but either low tax or totally tax-free. And I see some of these countries not cooperating with the EU or the United States at all. Because I see the world kind of getting more regional, and this one world government's just not going to work like the way they think it is. And we'll have to see what happens. I think it's going to culminate in a big economic crisis. Some people are probably going to call it a collapse, and there's going to be a rising inflation, and maybe seesaw with deflation, depending on what your assets are in. But anyhow, that's it for tonight. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. And if you remember the book by Lord Rees-Mogg, I forget who the co-author was, Lord Rees-Mogg, and of The Sovereign Individual, put it in the comments. I just remember reading as a kid, and I don't hear too many people talking about it, but it seems like what they described in the book is kind of happening now. So it's kind of cool, kind of interesting. I hadn't put the two together, but now that I see more podcasts talking about it, I'm starting to see how that's the kind of world we're living in, where you can have two classes of people, one that's lightly taxed or not taxed, one that's heavily taxed. That's, people who are mobile will be lightly taxed and regulated. People who can't be mobile, will be kind of a new serfdom is what I'm calling it. Serfs tied to the state or whatever state they're in. Anyways, good night. I'm going to upload this and wait for the comments. Thanks.